would not believe how many times I suddenly think of something that I know from biblical studies and that I can apply to Islamic stuff. It's incredible, so helpful. Like, have you ever heard of the idea of editorial fatigue?
No.
The idea is like Gospel of Mark is the original, and then Matthew and Luke both copy from Mark, right?
Yep.
So when they're adapting Mark to their own interests, right? Each of the authors has their own set of interests that emerges over the course of their material. They're changing material according to their given interest as an author, right?
Yeah.
The Quran does this as well. You can do the same thing with the Quran. What does the Quran do characteristically with all of its stories? The tendency is to shift authority from people to God, to shift agency from angels and other entities to God, right? So it's God who does it rather than an angel, or it's God who does it rather than whatever, right? So you can sort of see this in the Quran. Same thing in the Gospels, right? Like each Gospel has its own sort of goal or goals. They the different Gospels when they're reworking each other, they're changing the details of the stories to match their own contexts. But over time, as they're adapting, so like I'll make up an example. Let's say in Mark's version, it's like there are 5 things, and then in like Luke's version, he's changing it to so that there are 10, right? So every place in the narrative where Mark mentions 5, Luke has to change it to 10, right? But eventually you're going to slip up, right? Maybe you're tired, maybe you're getting towards the end of the narrative, maybe you make a mistake, maybe you miss it, but you miss some. And so then some places you include, oops, 5, where it only made sense in the original narrative, it doesn't make sense anymore in Luke. So you can sort of catch the editor red-handed when the editor or the redactor slips up. You see what I'm saying? And this happens over and over. And so they get fatigued. So they start off with their new version, but over time they default back to the original version that they're borrowing from at various points. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I found this looking at the Treaty of al-Hudaybiyyah. It's clear that the treaty was written by the Quraysh. It's clear from the original narrative, right? Who's speaking in the original version of the treaty that we can trace back to Ottawa? It's like, you have to send back to us anyone who comes to you. But we don't have to send back anyone who comes to us to you. Who's speaking? It's the Quraysh. It's not Muhammad, and it's not a neutral scribe. It's the Quraysh. The voice that comes through in the original treaty is actually just the Quraysh. And also, who does the treaty favor? It's the Quraysh. There's an asymmetrical relationship. When there's an asymmetrical treaty, right, and someone is there's a treaty and it's like really favors one party against the other, usually the party that it favors has written the treaty and then they're forced on the other. Hasn't been like, oh, it's like neutrally with agreed. You see what I'm saying? Like, so there's like something is badly off in the narrative where it's like, oh, who wrote it? Oh, they worked it out together and it was Ali who wrote it down. But then it's like you look at the voice, and it's like, who's speaking in the narrative? And it's we, the Quraysh, you, Muhammad. It's like, wait, this wasn't written by Ali. This was written by the Quraysh. You know what I mean? Like, there's something's off, right? But in Ibn Ishaq's version, at the beginning, it's neutral. Oh, this is what Muhammad and Suhail agreed upon. That they will do this and he will do that, and they and he and they and he. And it's like, oh, it's the neutral. It's as if it's sort of somehow being worked out together. And then in the second half, he slips back to the original. You and we and you and we. You know what I mean? Like, it's like editorial fatigue, right? And then when you look at the other transmissions from Ottawa by Hisham, especially, then suddenly you realize, oh, the whole thing originally was, and you also look at co-transmissions from Zuhri. The whole thing was originally in the voice of the Quraysh. It's the Quraysh speaking. They're writing this, right? And then you actually look closely as well at and then what does Ibn Ishaq say? Oh, Ali wrote it, and Musa ibn Uqba says this as well. When you look at other transmissions from Zuhri, and it's like, oh, it was a katib, a scribe. The Prophet called for a katib. And then another version, it's just the Quraysh. They're the ones writing it. It's like, obviously the Quraysh. Like, we will not write down Ar-Rahman. Who's the we? It's the Quraysh. They're writing it. And then it's the same in Hisham's version. So originally it was the Quraysh wrote it, but then it becomes, we're sort of working it out together, and it was written by a Muslim. And then you see what I'm saying? But that's most developed in Ibn Ishaq, but halfway through he slips back to the original. Oh, it's actually, do you see what I'm saying? And I only really was clear to me because I watched all those lectures for biblical studies, all those podcasts So really, that knowledge really comes through and helps out when looking at Islamic sources. Does that make sense? Sorry, I've gone
No,
way off
no,
on a
it's
tangent again.
no,
Of
it's yeah.
What do you think is the part of the narrative which talks about the rebellion after the treaty, like Omar and people like that getting really upset about it?
I suspect that is a narrative dramatization, and we don't actually know. Because the thing is, again, there's like a synoptic thing going on here. There's there's three main traditions on the events at al-Hudaybiyyah, right? There's the tradition of Urwa, right? And he passes it. If you imagine a tree branching out from Urwa, he passes it to Hisham, his son, right? And then there's transmissions from him. Passes it to Abu al-Aswad, the orphan he took care of. He passes it to Ibn Lahiya, who's Egyptian, and then it branches out from Ibn Lahiya. And then there's also Urwa passes it to Az-Zuhri, and then Az-Zuhri passes it to Musa ibn Uqba, to Ibn Ishaq, and then to Ma'mar, and then to a couple of others as well, right? And so that's one whole tradition. All of that is different versions of one tradition. That's all from Urwa, right? Then there's a version from al-Waqidi, who is a plagiarist, and he's nicked stuff from Ibn Ishaq, right? His version of the treaty has all these hyper-specific details that reflect specifically the like Ibn Ishaq's redaction of Az-Zuhri's redaction of Urwa's redaction of the material, right? And then it's like, oh, al-Waqidi independently has the same really specific outgrowths that we find in Ibn Ishaq. What are the odds? Like, because he's bloody nicked it. And there are all these other indications he stole stuff from Ibn Ishaq as well. So synoptic problem, right? Oh, this gospel is borrowing from that gospel. Al-Waqidi's version is borrowing from Ibn Ishaq's. We can sort of put it aside. So there's one more, and it's Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i, who's a great sort of Kufan figure, citing from al-Bara, right? Who's sort of a junior companion. And Abu Ishaq is Kufan, and Urwa is Medinan. So we have a Medinan version and a Kufan version, right? And so in the Medinan version, it's much more dramatized, right? We have all the pathos and we're going to leave so-and-so behind, and right, it's much more dramatic. And it's also exegetical. Oh, and this verse was revealed, and this verse was revealed, and so on. And it's also got miracles in it, right? And it's also got like artificial narrative structures, right? Things happen 3 times or whatever. Andreas Gurka talks about this, right? And then we turn to the version of Abu Ishaq, and it has none of that. It has none of that. It's a much simpler narrative. And in that version, it's just, they head out, they go somewhere to perform, they're heading to Makkah to perform the Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage. No mention of al-Hudaybiyyah. That's only from the Medinan tradition. But from the Kufan tradition, the location is not specified, right? And then the Quraysh come and they have the debate about, are we going to call you Rasulullah or not, right? In the treaty, right? And the Quraysh are like, we're obviously not going to call you that. And then they write out the treaty, and the treaty is a bit different. Some of the clauses now are quite different from what is in Urwa's version, but you can tell vaguely it's meant to be the same thing, right? And then here's the most interesting thing, by the way. In the version of Urwa, the treaty is signed, and part of the treaty is we're going to come back in a year's time, and then we'll perform Umrah. In the version of Abu Ishaq, they sign the treaty, and then they immediately carry out the treaty. The treaty is for now. They then immediately perform Umrah, stay for 3 days, and then they leave. It's crystal clear, right? It's actually for now. There's a fundamental difference. Now, if you look at the English translation of the version of this that ends up in the Sahih of Muslim, if you go onto sunnah.com, for example, look up the English version from Muslim, they've added in all these brackets in English, like for the treaty, brackets for next year. And then brackets, when they came back next year, they then performed the Umrah. It's like, well, that's not in the Arabic. It clearly follows straight on, right? It's like Ali is involved in the writing of the treaty in the Kufan version, which makes sense. It's Kufan per Ali, whatever, right? And they're arguing, Ali piously will not remove, Rasulullah, so Muhammad has to remove it from the text in the treaty. And then they perform Umrah. And then they come to Ali and say, okay, now get your guy out of here. and then they leave. It's like Ali is involved. You see what I'm saying? It's like this continuous self-contained narrative. Ali's at the beginning and the end. It's clearly just all happening at the same time. You know what I mean? Like it's one continuous narrative. It's clear that in the Kufan version, there is no coming back in a year. They come for Umrah, they sign the treaty, they carry out Umrah, and they leave. Anyway, we've gone way off topic, but that's sort of this is what I'm looking at right now, and it's really interesting stuff. Anyway, sorry.
What's so
big old
interesting
segue
is
there.
that same narrative is then later cited during the arbitration at Siffin to explain why
Yes.
Imam Ali didn't put his title in that arbitration, and he cites the Prophet as an example, and he cites his role as a scribe in that, and it's so interesting that narrative gets replicated.
Yeah, Ibn Abbas is the one who is made to mention Ali did this. He's arguing with the Khawarij, right? What's interesting is, who is this from, right? The common link for that tradition, it just so happens I looked at that one as well, right? So it's fresh in my mind. The common link is Ikrimah ibn Ammar. You know, he's a Basran who moved to El-Yamama. He's the common link for that tradition, right? Who is his source? It's a guy named Simak al-Hanafi, right? And where is Simak from? Well, originally he's from El-Yamama, and then he moved to Kufa, right? He's Kufan. And and he's mentioning, oh, Ali is the scribe. And where's Abu Ishaq, whose version it's, oh, Ali is the scribe? He's in Kufa. So it's clear, see what I'm saying? It's like, oh, interesting geographical connection to these, to both traditions, right? They're both connected to the same place, which is the pro-Ali place. Now, of course, there is interesting mystery. Why is it that at one time, Az-Zuhri said it was also Ali? Because that's what he said to Musa, Ibn Uqba, and Ibn Ishaq, right? And that's interesting. But clearly that's not the original. Az-Zuhri deviated. Because at other times, Az-Zuhri, it says basically it's the Quraysh, and that's also what Hisham says, both of them from Urwa. So we can see that the original from Urwa is the Quraysh write it, and then at a certain point, Az-Zuhri changes it, right? So they're clear there was a spreading idea that it was Ali. Ali was the scribe, and this is what was popular in Kufa. And that also shows up then in the tradition you just mentioned as well. So yeah, it's very interesting.
I will say that you're right, or I've noticed what you mentioned about how biblical studies can help you understand Islamic sources. I think that's been a huge asset for Derek and Myth Vision when bringing on Islamic scholars. And you could tell because he always refers or compares what Islamic scholars are saying about Islamic sources in comparison to what he understands with biblical scholarship. And it's really interesting to see him contrast it or compare the two, or show similarities in how you can understand text. So yeah, what you're saying makes sense in that regard. Yeah,
it's because what's funny is that I'll mention one more thing about this, and then let's get back to what we're actually here for. But there was one thing very interesting is the things that sort of Christian apologists will say to try and defend the sort of problems with the synoptic issues, right? Clearly these are conflicting accounts of the same event, right? And they'll try and do actually they're different events. I see the same thing with Hadith, right? But there's really no way around it in this case, right? Where it's like for example, the differences between the treaty, right? In one version of the treaty, right? Even just from Urwa, for example, right? There's major discrepancies in the transmissions from Urwa, right? And one version says, whoever wants to enter into an alliance with Muhammad can do so, and whoever wants to enter into an alliance with the Quraysh can do so, right? That's the version, that's that clause according to Az-Zuhri. And then according to Hisham, it's whoever enters into an alliance with Muhammad will be subject to the same conditions, right? He's speaking from the first person, but I'm paraphrasing here. And whoever enters into an alliance with the Quraysh is subject to the same conditions as the Quraysh, right? And then Ibn Lahiyah has something completely different. Whoever wants to go to Makkah can go through, can pass through, unmolested, and whoever wants to go to Medina or go through Medina can also pass through unmolested, right? So these are three different clauses, right? One is anyone who wants to join an alliance can join an alliance. The second is if you're allied with a party, you're subject to the same conditions as that party that have been outlined in this document. Those are two different propositions, right? And then the third one is totally different, which is, oh, whoever wants to travel in the other's territory is safe to do so, right? So people, I think, would immediately want to say, as in the case with the Gospels, oh, these are actually different clauses. There's no contradiction. They're just talking about different things. They're just different clauses. Each one is mentioning a different clause. But we know that that can't be right because the clause, in each case, the clause appears in basically the same place, right? In a non-initial position. In each case, it opens with the same, it's like a conditional, like whoever X, then Y, right? They all begin with men, women, right? It's like, and in each one is addressing both parties in succession, first the one party, then the other, right? And each one is then immediately followed by the same result, which is that one tribe jumps up and declares alliance for one party, and then the other tribe jumps up to declare alliance for the other, right? So these are, it's locked in. This is, it's in this, it's like, it's in the same position. It's got the same opening, same grammatical structure, same bilateral nature, same role, immediately preceding or prompting one tribe and then the other to jump up and make a declaration. So it's definitely the same clause. You see what I'm saying? It's like, well, there's no way out. It's like, this is the same clause and it has mutated. The gist has changed. So it's sort of like, it's interesting thinking about like how there are further analogies here where it's like, you know, people sort of want to deny contradictions where there clearly just are contradictions. You know what I mean? Like, and so it's exactly the same as in the case of the Gospels. Like clearly this is just, you know, clearly these are just two different versions of the same event and it's just contradictory. You know what I mean? And in this case, there's no way out. Like it's so locked in there because of those hyper-specific similarities. It's clearly meant to be the same clause. You know, even with the general difference of was the Umrah a year later, immediately after the treaty? You know, you can just sort of read it and you can just see, like, if I was reading this by itself and not trying to smash into this text content from the other text, what would I conclude? And what you would conclude is, oh, these are two totally different scenarios. In one case, Umrah is a year later, and the other case, it's immediately after the, you know, it's just, it happens immediately, you know. So it's just totally gratuitous then to try and sort of smash one text into the other, you know what I mean? And try and sort of construct a kind of, you know, it was both the shepherds and the wise men came to visit Jesus. Like, these are, you know, these are from different stories. Sorry. Anyway, oh yeah. So yeah, I agree with the, you know, the benefits of biblical insights.
What I just wanted, just before we go off this, I was just thinking when you were talking, what's really interesting is that the Quranic narrative also supports the idea that it was written by the Quraysh, because later on, when the women migrate, the Prophet uses the hole that is left in the treaty that the women, that there was no clause about what the women should do in terms of being sent back. That if women migrate, that they are, because it just says men in the treaty, it doesn't say women. And if he had written that himself, yeah, whereas it was an oversight of the Quraysh, they just didn't include the women in their treaty, so he was able to exploit that whole to say that they could stay.
So I have bad news in that regard. The version that says men, there is a version that says men.
Okay.
But it's only one. Let me just find it. Give me a second. Which is the yeah, Ma'mar. The redaction of Ma'mar from az-Zuhri from Urwa specifies rajul, right? Any man, but none of the others say that. The others just say man, whoever, right? So so probably my guess, I mean, without having looked at it further, my guess is that what you're talking about is building off a particular version, but is probably not part of the original. You see what I'm saying? So I don't know if that would...
Do you think the exegesis for that verse isn't actually related to Hudaybiyyah, or is it just, it's building off a separate narrative?
It may be. What I'm saying is that there's the clever sort of legal ploy that is attributed to the Prophet as a way to rationalize that seems dependent on a very specific redaction of the treaty that is not the original. That's not what it, like the original back to Urwa doesn't specify rajul. That's actually Ma'mar's redaction of az-Zuhri's redaction of Urwa's version. You see what I'm saying? So I mean, I have to look into it more because I'm still process is still going on. But that my immediate thought there would be, well, the other versions don't say man, or the original actually is just whoever, man, whoever comes, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
So in that sense, how do we explain that verse then that talks about the fact that women are an exception?
Oh, it may just be that the prophet is just breaking the treaty, and that's him breaking the treaty. And he's just saying, oh, we're saying that we're making an exception for the women. But it's not, okay. You see what I'm saying? Like, so that part may be right. But the thing about, technically, it's sort of like the Shakespeare thing. Like, no, it's the Lord of the Rings does it better, right? The Lord of the Rings thing, like, I can be killed by no man. It's like, oh, well, actually, I'm a woman. It's like, surprise. Like, it's like, what a legalistic prophecy. It's like, what a pedantic prophecy. But so I don't think something like that happened here, because I think the treaty, under any reasonable interpretation, at least in the original version that we can trace back to Ottawa, for example, I think it's, I think it's just clearly saying whoever. It isn't strictly saying man. Only from what I'm seeing here in the different redactions of the treaty, only Ma'mar's redaction, i.e. what he changed from Zuhri, from Ottawa, has Rajul, right? But the co-transmissions from Zuhri don't even have this, let alone the co-transmissions from Ottawa. So you can tell, this is something that Ma'mar has added in, right? So
it's been added in precisely to explain that verse. Do you think?
It could well be. These things could go in any direction. It may well be that he added it in as a way to sort of set that up. It may also just be the case that he added that in, and then someone else was like, man, yes, maybe, made the connection. These things, you have to look at more. You have to collect all of the relevant traditions and line them all up, and then look at them all and see if you can figure out the relationship there. So who knows? La three. So.